Hi and welcome to Whisky Shared. You're watching Ready to Drink Whisky Cocktails. I'm Toby and you're watching Whisky Shared. Welcome to Ready to Drink Whisky Cocktails. In this episode I'm looking at pre-mixed ready to drink whisky cocktails. I've got two for you. I've got the Glenfiddich Manhattan and I've got the Johnnie Walker Old Fashioned. Ready to drink and pre-mixed cocktails are quite popular at the moment, and obviously they're there for a certain reason. They save time, potentially money, and they're also perfect for people that don't really know where to start when making cocktails. These two particular ones are probably the most common and most popular whisky cocktails, so I thought these would make good candidates to show you whether or not they're worth buying. Shall we find out what they taste like? On to the whiskies. So let's start with the Johnnie Walker Old Fashioned. It comes in a 50cl bottle, it's 20.5% ABV, and it retails for £15 in the UK. The suggested serving size is 100 millilitres, so you get 5 servings per bottle. Let's start with the nose and see what we get. Right, so the first thing I get is orange. There's like orange oil. There's cinnamon. There's lots of sweet brown sugar. There's some honey. There's a hint of aniseed. And there's also a little bit of smoke in there as well. Let's move on to the palate. Yeah, so on the palate it's very sweet. I'm getting lots of brown sugar. The sweetness is then turning into honey. It definitely is very sugary, it's very cloying on the palate. But yeah, the sweetness is the dominant note. Let's have another sip. Yeah, so along with that really noticeable sweetness, there is smoke. I'm not sure if this is made from Johnnie Walker Red, possibly, but there is obviously a smoke note in Johnnie Walker Red Label. There's also that orange note that I picked up on the nose, definitely a noticeable orange oil. And with that, there's a bitter note, and I'm assuming that this comes from the bitters that are added to an old fashioned. Let's have one final sip. Yeah, so I'm starting to get cinnamon and nutmeg. They're really quite nice. The sweetness though is the overriding feature of this particular drink. It's very sweet. It's pleasant tasting, but it lacks bite. I think the ABV at 20.5% ABV is a little bit on the low side. The sweetness is probably a little bit heavy. Obviously adding ice does help with the sweetness, but as it dilutes, it also takes away some of that alcohol, which is a little bit disappointing. But I think this is good for the occasional drinker. I think this is good for parties. I think it's good for if you want to save your good whiskey when making an old fashioned. But obviously an old fashioned is quite simple. It's sugar, it's whiskey and it's bitters. So sugar is normally either white or brown sugar traditionally, but I prefer using honey or maple syrup. You can pre-mix that if you want, or you can add it from the start. Add a splash of hot water to the syrup or the honey and dilute that, add the bitters and add the whiskey, and it works really well. Just a couple of dashes of bitters is all you need, but sometimes you don't have those ingredients, or sometimes you don't want to buy those sorts of ingredients if you aren't a regular, you don't really like old fashions as a regular drink and just like them occasionally. So this could be an option, but there's definitely better options out there. Should we move on to the next cocktail? On to the second and final whiskey cocktail. It's the Glenfiddich Scotch Manhattan. It comes in a 50cl bottle, it's 30% ABV, and it retails for £22.50, and its serving size is 83 millilitres. Let's start with the nose. So the first thing I get with this is charred oak. There's a hint of sherry, definitely sherry. There's malted barley, cherries. It definitely smells like a whiskey. It smells like a sherried whiskey. I'm also getting a hint of pickles, like pickled gherkins. It's not a bad thing though. Let's move on to the palate. Yeah, so the palate, I'm getting malted barley. There's that sort of sweet vermouth note, which is obviously what this Manhattan is made with. It definitely tastes more like a sweet fortified wine than a sherry, but it's very nice indeed. There's some cherry, like cherry syrup, like maraschino cherries. It's really nice, and ever so slightly drying on the palate as well. Let's have another sip. Yeah, I'm getting some charred oak. I'm getting some tannins, and yeah, that sweet vermouth note is definitely sort of across the palate. It's very sweet and ever so slightly drying. I'd say this is halfway between a whiskey and a cocktail. It definitely tastes like a sherried whiskey or a wine finished whiskey more than it does a cocktail. But there is a hint of sort of artificial sweetness, like from the cherry syrup, that sort of note that I'm getting. It's very nice though and very drinkable. Let's have one final sip. Yeah, this is a very tasty cocktail indeed. I think it's well constructed. I think the ice is probably not needed. I think if you've been able to refrigerate this for up to 3 hours, like it says on the bottle, then I think ice is probably not needed at all. It's I think the ABV is quite good. I think 30% ABV is a nice ABV to be drinkable, and I think if you add ice, then obviously a large ice cube it's got to be, otherwise it could water it down quite quickly. I think in terms of value, this is obviously $22.50 in the UK for a 50cl bottle at 30% ABV. I think that's not bad. Obviously, if you were to buy the ingredients and make it yourself, it probably wouldn't be much more sort of money saving, but obviously you could choose what whiskey goes in this. This is obviously going to be Glenfiddich 12-year-old, I guess, and yeah, it's not a bad choice. It's quite a robust whiskey. It's quite a well-known whiskey, and obviously that name is what helps sell the bottle. But I think this is definitely a good starting place. I think if you're new to sort of Manhattan cocktails and you don't necessarily want to go out and buy all the ingredients to maybe not use them again, I think this would be a good alternative. In terms of value as whiskey cocktails go though, the two whiskies that I've featured, the Johnnie Walker and this Glenfiddich whiskey cocktail, I think the Johnnie Walker is the weaker of the two. I think the Johnnie Walker is probably a little too low ABV and a little bit too sweet, although I'm sure there will be some people out there that really like it. I think having made a lot of Manhattans, having tried a lot of Manhattans, and having tried a lot of Old Fashioned and made a lot of Old Fashions, I think this Glenfiddich Scotch Manhattan is probably the nearest to what you go out and get in a bar, whereas the Old Fashioned from Johnnie Walker, I think, is probably a little bit too sweet and a little bit too low ABV. So I think I'd definitely give that a miss in future. But I think it's a good beginner's sort of starting point. I think there are better ones out there. The Batch and Bottle Old Fashioned is definitely better than the Johnnie Walker one. But obviously it's personal preference and depends on what your budget is. There's also independents out there, so look for other brands that, you know, may not necessarily feature, you know, the whiskey brand on the front of the bottle, but there's definitely some good ones to be had out there with higher ABVs and better quality ingredients. If you've tried either of these, then let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if there is a particular brand out there that you have tried that you'd recommend, also share that in the comments. And, you know, if there's a particular way that you make your Manhattan or you make your Old Fashioned, also share that in the comments and I'll pin the best one. Hopefully you found that interesting and hopefully you'll go out and find some cocktails. Stauncher.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, why not give it a like or a comment, and please consider subscribing for more videos like this.